Hello, everyone. We'll give everyone just a minute to try and settle into our meeting today and pick up any stragglers we have. Thank you all so much for joining us. If you can, in the chat box, just to confirm that people can hear me and can see me, if you could just put like a, yeah, that would be really helpful.
And if you can see me as well and hear me.
Thank you very much. We appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. Hi, everyone. I'm Mattie. I'm the program manager at Girl Scouts of Silver Sage, and I am joined with Sarah, our program coordinator. As you might have known, we had an earthquake yesterday, which for people like Sarah and I can be really exciting because we both have backgrounds in geoscience. So Sarah, would you like to share a little bit about your background in geoscience?
Yeah, so I got a bachelor's degree in geosciences from Idaho State University in Pocatello with a minor in something called GIS, or Geographic Information Systems, which is a fancy term for mapping. Graduated from there and also taught a year of earth science in a middle school in eastern Idaho. So that's my background.
Thank you, Sarah. We're joined by my cat, Josie. She will probably be running around through this, so just ignore her. She has no geology background whatsoever. Myself, I used to teach geoscience at a treatment center for troubled youth, and then I also volunteered at the Idaho Museum of Mining and Geology, and I studied geoscience as well throughout college. So today we're going to be talking about earthquakes, of course, and we're also going to start off with what an earthquake is and how it's caused and some of those like commonly asked questions about earthquakes. Afterwards, we're going to go a little bit into the earthquake that happened yesterday specifically, and then at the very end we'll have some time for questions and answers. As we're going through this, though, if you have questions, drop them into the box and either Sarah or I will try and answer them. Something that I just saw from Eliza is geo what? That's a great question. I probably should have explained it. So what Sarah and I are saying is geoscience, which is the science of Earth and Earth's processes. You might hear the word geology or earth science kind of used alongside all of them. But yeah, if you guys have questions as we go, drop them into the chat and we will try and answer them. So starting off from the very beginning, some of us probably know that the Earth has layers. A fun activity I like to do is with Play-Doh. And so I made a ball of Play-Doh, and in the inside is our core, and then our mantle, and our, what's it called? Crust. So in the very middle of our Earth, that little black dot, that one is a solid metal core surrounded by mantle, all the orange stuff, you can tell. And mantle is kind of like semi-molten rock. And on the very, very outside, that green layer that's pretty thin, that's the crust, and that's what we're standing on right now. So the crust is, if Sarah, do you want to go to the first slide?
Yes, ma'am.
So our crust is kind of broken up into puzzle pieces that we call tectonic plates. So if you can see what Sarah is sharing, she's sharing a map of the world, and there's all these little outlines that look like a puzzle piece. And each one of these are a tectonic plate. So you can imagine them kind of on top of the magma. Ooh, good question. Callie asks, how many tectonic plates are there? Sarah, do you know that one off the top of your head?
I'm counting.
There's several main ones, but there's also little chunks of one. A cool one I like to point out, if you look at North America, and you look at where Seattle would be, that Juan de Fuca plate, it's super, super tiny, and it's left over from pretty much when the dinosaurs were roaming. So it's pretty old.
I think there's about 17, if I remember right.
17, great. So sometimes, Sarah, you wanna go to the next slide? Sometimes these plates, they'll hit into each other, and they interact with each other in different ways. So the first one that you see on the left, that transform one, this is when plates are going next to each other like this. They're sliding by each other. These ones actually cause most of those lower earthquakes that we have experienced in our life. And a famous fault that you might think of is the San Andreas Fault. So it primarily moves side to side. The next one in the middle, this is called a convergent plate. So you can imagine two things coming together, and the heavier one is going to sink underneath. In this situation, we usually see volcanoes. So you can think of Japan or Chile or the Pacific Northwest, those areas where there's volcanoes. That's caused by these convergent plates and ones going underneath. And the last type of plate is a divergent plate. Where you're really going to see this is the Atlantic Ocean right in the middle. And what's happening is magma from in the earth is pushing up and pushing the plates out. So it's making new crust all the way out. And these plates are made of rock. So you can go really into it in terms of there's oceanic and continental plates, but really oceanic plates are made of really hard, dense rock. Continental plates, which the continents are made of, is made of a little bit less dense, more light colored rock.
So Christy, you have a great question. Why does the earth shake when they push together? Sometimes when things push together, they kind of get stuck, or pieces break off, or sometimes it just doesn't work right all the time. They don't like to go smoothly. And so when those pieces get stuck or when things break off, that's when we see an earthquake.
So what happens in Earth's processes is a lot of things are under stress. You can imagine rocks are giant and they have a lot of mass and they're pushing against each other all the time. And that's a lot of stress, right? And if you're pushing and pushing and pushing, eventually you have to break a little bit. And that's when that earthquake happens, is when all of that stress is finally released. It releases that energy and that starts the shaking. And we'll go into that a little bit more. But essentially, an earthquake is caused from stress on rocks. And those rocks just can't take it anymore and they slip. So Sarah, do you want to go into where do earthquakes happen?
Yes, ma'am. So earthquakes happen in two main places. So if we go back to our map of plate tectonics, if you see all those black lines, that's where earthquakes happen, in one of the places that earthquakes can happen. But if you notice, Idaho is nowhere near one of those lines, right? So you might be asking, Sarah, why are we having an earthquake here? There's no plate tectonics. So that's when we come up to something called a fault, or a break in the earth. So faults happen when the earth is stretched, or when the earth is pushed together from these plate tectonics, and they'll push together and create this thing called a reverse fault, which is the one here in the middle, when one side will go up above the other side. When they're stretched apart, you see a normal fault, or the one on top, is when one side goes down in comparison to the other side. And the last one you see is a strike-slip fault, which is the same thing as a transform boundary, so they're moving next to each other all the time. That's all I got, yeah.
Sarah, we have a really good question about volcanoes, and I know it's a little bit more up your alley. When volcanoes erupt, is that from the plates pushing together? Can you explain a little bit more about why they would erupt?
So volcanoes happen, if you look at this slide here in the middle, we have our continental and our oceanic crust, our convergent plate boundary. And when we have our plate going underneath down into the mantle, like Mattie was explaining earlier with the Earth's layers, when we have that happen, it melts because it's so hot down there. And so over time, that melted rock pushes up through the surface and creates pressure there. And because the plates are going down, that's a great question. So the volcanoes are made because the plate is going down and it's kind of pushing that land that it's going under, it's pushing it up and it's creating these mountains. So if any of you have ever been to the western side of Oregon or the western side of Washington, And you've seen all those mountains there, Mount St. Helens and Mount Rainier and Mount Adams and Mount Shasta. All of those are volcanoes created by a convergent plate boundary on the edge of the North American continent. So they are created by that pressure, and then the magma itself comes up and creates pressure there, and then they erupt.
Thank you, Sarah. So the next thing we're going to talk about is the shock waves. So what we actually felt yesterday and that shaking and why that happens. When the earth, so we have that rock, it's a lot of stress against each other, a lot of pushing, and it slips. There's a lot of energy stored up there. You can imagine if you're pushing against someone else's hands and they let go, you're still gonna fall. You still have a lot of energy. And so when that releases, that energy has to go somewhere, and it goes out in something called seismic waves. So these waves are most powerful, of course, right where the earthquake happened. In this case, that was about east of Chalice, and they get smaller as they go out. So the further away from Chalice you were, the less you're gonna feel it. These actually move 20 times the speed of sound, which was a fact that just kind of blew my mind in how fast these tremors were moving to actually reach everyone. And there are two types of waves, which is what you're seeing in this these two diagrams. The first one is an S wave, and these waves shake. So if you had a slinky and you shook the slinky, that's how they move. The other one is called P waves, and they push. So if you were to push a slinky and it moves like that. And these are just different types of waves that affect us. It's why we feel a little bit of shaking and rolling. And we can feel some of these aftershocks of this kind of continuing for us, for this specific earthquake, about a day after. It's not going to be months and months like the last earthquake in Chalice was, since it is a much smaller earthquake. Yesterday, though, you probably did feel a couple, and Sarah will talk a little bit more later about, we have a map of all the aftershocks that have been occurring, which has been pretty cool to see. All right, Sarah.
Okay, so a good question that I think I saw is, how do we know how big what is an epicenter? Sorry, I skipped a slide. So an epicenter, let me scroll over real quick. An epicenter is where a earthquake went off on the surface. So it's a map point. So we can put a point on a map where we say that this happened. A focus, on the other hand, is below the Earth's crust, or in the Earth's crust, and where the earthquake came from. So a focus is underground, and the epicenter is above ground. They're right on top of each other, but the focus tells us exactly where an earthquake was. So our earthquake, the focus of our earthquake, was 10 kilometers underground. And then some people have asked me, how do we know where it was? How do we know where the epicenter is? So the way that scientists, there's so many ways to do this, but a really easy way to do it is to use these circles as kind of a comparison. Let's say there's 3 places near where the earthquake was that have something called a seismograph. And so they have instruments there that can tell them how intense it was, how long it lasted, and that gives them all sorts of different data points. And from that data, they can create these circles that are kind of a radius, if you know, so how far away the earthquake was from that seismograph. And if you have many, many different seismographs creating all these different circles, you can find where they all overlap, and that's where the earthquake happened. And so usually they have more than 3, usually they have dozens. So we have seismographs all over the state that will do those things for us. Okay, Mattie, do you want to talk about how big they can get? You are muted. 1 second.
Thank you. Thank you. I muted, my cat was having fun with a box and then I got stuck. So along with seismic waves, there we go, being used to locate where the earthquake happened, it can also be used to measure how big an earthquake is. When Sarah and I were in school, it was called the Richter scale in terms of like how destructive an earthquake is, but it is now called the moment magnitude scale. So we're switching, her and I are switching that one. So they use a seismograph to measure the size of these waves. And on this scale, you'll kind of see anything under a 3, you're not gonna feel. Earthquakes are happening constantly. Sarah has a really great resource at the end that you can actually track all the earthquakes happening. And most of them are just so small, we can't feel them. Some people talked about how their animals seem to like sense the earthquake. Animals can feel those vibrations a little bit better than us, so it's possible. Our earthquake specifically was a 6.5. And something's really important to know about this scale is that it is exponential. So Sarah can correct me here, but each level is 10 times the next, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So just at one jump on the scale, it's a pretty big jump. So you can't really compare a 6 to a 7 or even a 6.5 to 6.8. It's a pretty big scale. So some things that we saw were some shaking, and that was about it. That earthquake wasn't going to cause any buildings to collapse, so we're really lucky about that. And it's because we're not near one of those major boundaries, those transform boundaries that would cause bigger earthquakes like this.
And what's important to remember is it was a 6.5 where it happened, but what we felt here in Boise was more like a 3.0. So we didn't feel the full effect of the earthquake's epicenter.
I noticed some people say, my dog didn't notice it. My cat slept through the whole thing. It woke me up from a nap, but she was fine. All right,
okay,
Sarah.
So some questions that we've been getting from some friends is, can scientists predict earthquakes? There's a really good answer to that. It's no. No, we can't. There's no good way for people to predict an earthquake. There's ways to predict volcanoes, there's ways to predict weather, but earthquakes are just something that we cannot predict. We're never going to know when it's going to happen. Another question that Mattie and I get a lot is, will we feel aftershocks? And the answer to that varies based on where you are, based on how strong the earthquake was. For our earthquake, I haven't personally felt any aftershocks. I don't know if Mattie has. Most of the aftershock, you felt one?
One, yeah.
So most of the aftershocks have been in the 3.0 to 4.0 range on the moment magnitude scale. And so we're not going to feel those. You might feel them up where they actually happen, but we wouldn't feel them from so far away. But aftershocks do happen in earthquakes, and sometimes they're usually not as strong, but sometimes they can still be very strong. Okay.
And something too, I think that is important here is that while we can't predict when earthquakes can happen, geoscientists and other scientists have really mapped out where all of those fault lines are, where potential earthquakes could happen, so that people who live in those areas, cities who are susceptible to this type of stuff, can prepare for it better. And something really cool about Idaho, specifically where this earthquake occurred, is that we're on really solid granite up there, so things don't shake that much. So luckily, even if there was a lot of shaking, it's pretty stable ground, and they're gonna be okay.
Perfect. So now that we've got in the basics covered, let's jump into the earthquake we had yesterday. Mattie, go for it.
So Sarah sent me some really cool things last night, and one of them was that specifically what the fault line was that actually had the earthquake. So the fault that caused the earthquake actually separates that Stanley Basin from the Sawtooth Mountains. So the Sawtooth Mountains are uplifted, the basin is below, and that fault line that runs between is how that is separating. The earthquake that we felt was a 6.5 on the moment magnitude scale, as we mentioned. Something I found really cool, I brought out all my old notebooks in college, and a 5 on the Richter scale, or the MMS scale, is equivalent to 2 million space shuttles taking off at once. So you can imagine what a 6.5 would be then, which is pretty cool. And so this fault line, if you ever go up into this area, so you go to like Redfish, Stanley, Ketchum, that type of area, you're going to see a lot of really beautiful granite rocks, those white rocks with some speckles in them. And all of that is visible because of the faults up here. So those rocks had a lot of stress, they moved, and now we're able to see the rocks because of those faults.
And the map that you guys can see right now, this is of the area where the earthquake happened. So the big red circle, that's the initial volcano, or I keep saying volcano, the initial earthquake that happened, the big one that we all felt. And then all these little red dots are the aftershocks. Also, you see these red lines. There's one here called the Sawtooth Fault. So this is a fault that is south of where those earthquakes happened. And then I saw earlier someone asked when the last noticeable earthquake was in Idaho, besides the one from yesterday. That was in 1983, so before most of you were born. And that was a place called Mount Bora, which is the tallest mountain in Idaho. And it was right here on this really solid red line in the Lost River Range. So that actually created something called a scarp, which is when the earth breaks and it falls into the valley. So Mattie and I were just there a couple of weeks ago, and since it was only 30 years ago that this happened, you can still see the difference between where the mountains were and where they are now. And there's a really big difference still. And so we think that that's actually going to happen in Stanley now. They're going to have a little bit of a different landscape.
A good question I saw in here is, was this Idaho's first earthquake? While we have earthquakes every day constantly, this was the second largest earthquake to happen in Idaho. So the first being that one that Sarah just talked about, and then this one being the second. So we do have earthquakes quite a bit, but this one was the second largest, so pretty significant.
So if I have any Eastern Idaho girls on here, about 2 or 3 years ago, there was an earthquake in Soda Springs that Pocatello felt. I lived in Pocatello at the time, and I felt it, and it was pretty cool. Not as strong as the one that we felt yesterday, but I could feel it. So if any of you Pocatello girls or Soda Springs girls, you probably felt the earthquake a couple of years ago.
So Sarah, do you want to show them how to view what earthquakes are happening around the world?
Yeah, so there is a really cool website from the USGS, which is the United States Geologic Survey, and they are the experts when it comes to anything geology related. So this website's called earthquake.usgs.gov, and what you're going to come into is this world map, and it shows these red lines are our plate boundaries, and then all these dots here are different earthquakes that have happened today or in the last 24 hours. And so if we zoom in, you see that really big dot. If we zoom in, that is our Chalice area. And last time Mattie and I checked, that definitely wasn't as busy as it is now. I think there was only about 10 when we checked. Now you can see this one here is our 6.5. So this popped up when I clicked on it, our 6.5 earthquake inch 72 kilometers west of Chalice yesterday. But all these little guys here are aftershocks. So we have a 3.4 and a 3.1. So all these little 3.0 to 4.0 earthquakes are happening now in this area just because an aftershock of this larger earthquake. So the earth is settling again.
Sarah, there's a couple good questions in here. Where would you find the most earthquakes? Can you show them on this map again?
Where you would find the most earthquakes in the whole world? So the most earthquakes happen on plate boundaries. So we have a lot of coworkers that lived in California a few years ago, and they were pretty chill about this earthquake happening because they're like, oh, I had one of those like every other day when I lived in California. And so California has quite a few earthquakes. You can see there was just one today in Little Lake, California. So a little guy in California today. Another place you're going to see a lot of earthquakes is right here off the coast of Alaska. So there's a lot of different earthquakes that happen right in here. You're going to see a lot in Japan. So you see there's actually 4 different plates all smashing into one another right here. And so we have a lot of earthquake activity. One really cool place you're not going to guess we have earthquake activity is Hawaii. So we have a lot of earthquakes, not right now, it's making me a liar, but we have a lot of earthquakes that happen in Hawaii because of all the volcanic activity. So volcanoes can produce little earthquakes all the time. They're not dangerous and they don't tell us much, but they happen all the time. So yeah, this website is really cool to go check out every once in a while. It's updated every 5 minutes, 10 minutes, and you can see all the things that are happening. And you can tell like these plate boundaries here are hot spots for earthquake activity. There's some that are directly on these plate boundaries.
And then there's another good question. If you want to bring up that MMS scale again, the question was, what is the biggest earthquake that has ever happened?
Chile in 1960.
Almost a 10.
I think it was a 9.8. If I remember correctly.
Can an earthquake cause a volcano to erupt?
I don't think it's ever happened, but I wouldn't say no.
Great. So at this point, we are opening up our questions. So if you want to, let's keep the chat just for questions, just for right now. I can see people having fun, but if you guys have any questions for me or Sarah about earthquakes or geology, now is the time to ask them.
And before we get into that, I just want to let you guys know what happened yesterday is not dangerous. You don't have to freak out. Nothing bad happened. This is normal for a lot of people. I don't want you guys to get scared or anything like that. Nothing bad is going to happen to us here.
What's important is that we as Girl Scouts are prepared for any sort of situation, whether that be something like this virus and being stuck at home, or it's something like an earthquake. And that's a good conversation to have with your families about what does that readiness look like for you guys, because it can look different for everyone. Of course, my readiness plan is going to involve my cat. Yours is not going to involve my cat. So I would say that if that's something that you're concerned about, it's a good conversation to have with your family about how to be prepared. But Idaho is not known for horrible earthquakes, so this is a pretty safe place to be.
Okay, I see a question that I really like. It says, do earthquakes happen on other planets? So as of right now, I think the only one that they've ever recorded earthquakes on is Mars. Because Mars is the only other planet in the solar system that has plate tectonics like we do. So they have volcanoes there, and they have water, and they have earthquakes all the time. They actually have the biggest volcano in the universe on Mars.
So if we go back to our Play-Doh ball, this inside, having that iron core and this molten rock mantle is what essentially keeps a planet alive, and it's what causes plate tectonics. There's a lot of science into that as to why it happens, but you can think almost like a convection oven. If there's heat happening, there's movement, and that helps to drive our planet. And if a planet does not have a molten inside and a solid like iron or nickel core, there's nothing to cause any plate tectonics to happen. with Mars specifically, we have evidence that it did used to totally be active and plate tectonics were occurring, and that's why we're able to see things like the giant volcano. Allison asked, where was the largest? It was Chile, if you didn't hear that one. The largest earthquake was in Chile.
In 1960, so before Mattie and I were born.
Yes.
I see a good one. Where are the best places to go if another earthquake happens? So the best places is under a door. So that's a good place to be because that's
a door frame.
Yeah, so under your door frame, that's a good solid place to be. If you can't get there, don't move. That's the biggest part, is don't move too far. If we have an earthquake, just sit down, cover your head if it's a big earthquake and you think things are going to start falling. But you don't want to start running around because you get disoriented really easily and you could fall.
I see a good question. My friends asked me this one yesterday. Is yesterday's earthquake related to the volcano in Yellowstone? No, it is not. You do not have to worry about Yellowstone. It's not going to happen. So you're okay. Don't worry. And there is no connection to the fault line that actually had the earthquake and Yellowstone. They're quite a long ways away.
If you guys ever want to learn about Yellowstone, let Mattie and I know, and we can do another one of these.
What was the most harmful earthquake? That would have been Chile as well. Sarah, if you want to open up that graph one more time. Yep. For those who are watching who are interested in learning about other earthquakes, I recommend maybe taking some notes real fast. There's really good articles about them. You can learn more about what was happening.
Mattie, you are breaking up, just in case, if you don't know that. You're freezing up on us. Let me look and see if we can find some other. I see a lot of when was the first earthquake. I don't know. Mattie, do you want to do a quick Google search of the first recorded earthquake?
What about the one that happened yesterday? When the first one happened there?
What
time was that?
It's like 5:28, something like that.
Okay. Yeah. Stephanie asked if this call would be recorded for girls. Yes, this call is recorded, and we will be posting it to either our Facebook or our website. I will not vouch for that. I will ask our marketing manager, but it will be posted for the girls.
Do you guys have any more questions? Can you feel earthquakes in outer space? I don't know. I've never been. I would assume yes, if you were standing on the planet that had the earthquake, but can't tell you from personal experience.
Who are the people that study earthquakes? What are they called?
They are called seismologists or structural geologists as well. They're a bunch of guys that like hiking out in the middle of nowhere, or a bunch of girls too. I have a lot of girlfriends who do it. They like to just go and map things and look at rocks, and that is their happy place, is in a tent in the mountains.
Some questions I'm seeing are how many earthquakes happen on average and how long is an earthquake? These are things that are really hard to guess, much along with predicting earthquakes in and of itself. It's hard for us to say on average there'll be one earthquake with this many aftershocks. Essentially because when that rock has its stress, it's strained, the aftershocks are it kind of settling back into place, and we don't know how long it's going to take them to do that. For this specific earthquake that just happened, our aftershocks should only go for a day or two after.
Is it safe to climb a tree? No, during an earthquake. Do not climb a tree during an earthquake. Do not go near a tree during an earthquake. What is the kind that forms the Rocky Mountains? Do you mean so Katerina, do you mean the rocks that form the Rocky Mountains, or what formed the Rocky Mountains?
Fault.
So I'm guessing your question is what formed the Rocky Mountains, and that has to do with the faulting and the compression of the continent. So we have this thing called the basin and range is kind of what we live in. Here, let me see, I have a kind of a picture of it. We have this, so right now the earth is being stretched. And so with that, we have pieces of the earth falling down. So these are all different little faults. But when the earth comes together, compresses, we have the opposite happen. We have faults going, so these pieces here would be going up instead of down. So instead of valleys, we get mountains. Can you feel earthquakes in the ocean? I'm sure you can. If they happen in the ocean, a lot of places get tsunami alerts. A lot of places in Hawaii or Japan or places that are close to coastal places, they get tsunami alerts if there is an earthquake near them in the ocean.
I saw a question about, can earthquakes be used to study the layers of the earth? Will you go to the P&S wave scale or diagram? So it's hard to study the layers of the earth, obviously, because we've never been through the one we're on right now. We have dug through as far as we can. We cannot get to the mantle. It's just impossible. It gets too hot. There's too much pressure down there. But what we can do is use earthquakes to actually measure inside. So these P&S waves, I don't remember which one. One of them cannot travel through liquid. So when we have a map of these earthquakes, we can see where one of the waves stops, and then we know it's liquid. So that's how we know that the inner part of our Earth is partially liquid because of things like this. So that's how we use earthquakes to study other parts of the Earth.
Oh gosh, so many questions.
They do not name earthquakes like they do tornadoes and hurricanes.
I'm kind of disappointed about that. Can there be a tornado during an earthquake? Yeah, they don't happen because of each other, but I mean, I'm sure it's possible. Eliza, I see your hand is up. Can you type your question in?
A question I see is, can earthquakes go up? This is really cool because it's something that I got to study when I was in school. Earthquake prevalence can get higher depending on some of the situations that are happening in that area. Initially, you would think that California is the earthquake capital of the US because of how many earthquakes happen there on a daily basis, but it's actually Oklahoma and parts of Texas because they have a lot of fracking there, and in fracking you go into the ground and you essentially remove layers, and so it weakens it and causes more earthquakes, and so all these earthquakes are at that same level that this fracking is happening, and so it's increasing the prevalence of earthquakes. Stuff like that is not happening in Idaho, so we don't have anything that would increase the prevalence of earthquakes. It would have to be something that is going into the earth and like greatly removing masses of earth to increase that.
So Julia, you had a question, why do earthquakes cause tsunamis? So that happens because when the earth shakes, it creates it makes, so have you ever like gotten into a bathtub or done a cannonball in a pool? So if something disrupts the water, it's gonna start moving away from what it's being disrupted by. So when we have an earthquake in the middle of the ocean, those waves, so the P&S waves from the earthquake, are pushing that water away from the epicenter. So that's when we get tsunamis.
So friends, I think we're getting to the end of this, but before we kind of start to wrap things up, I'd love to hear, I know that some of you had mentioned that Yellowstone is something you'd be interested in hearing about. My background is in glaciology and geomorphology, which is like how landforms are made, is the simple way of saying that. And Sarah's background is in mapping. And so we would love to do something like this again. If there are other national parks you're interested in, we can tell you about the geology of those parks, like Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Canyon's my personal favorite.
I can do Hawaii.
Hawaii, yes, Sarah can do all of Hawaii. So I'd love to, if you can just jump into the chat and type anything that you'd really like to see from us, because this was really fun and we'd like to do it again. Pangea, ooh, that's a good one.
I see a lot about Yellowstone, so that could be a cool one to do. We could
Canyon.
do one of geology on just national parks in general, like pick a few different national parks.
Ooh, fossils, that's a good one.
Ooh, that would be so much fun.
Sand dunes, love it.
Doing geology of Idaho, maybe.
Grand Canyon.
Okay, we'll have to, Mattie and I will talk.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all so much for joining us today. You feel free to continue to put stuff in the chat, but we are ending this chat now. Thank you so much. Again, my name is Mattie, and I'm the program manager at Girl Scouts of Silver Sage, and I was joined here by Sarah, our program coordinator. We miss you all, and we hope you really enjoyed this video.
Have a great day.